morning, Penn State fans. It's Wednesday, January 22nd. It's BWI Live. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickle from Blue White Illustrated. As we talk at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday, Penn State's defensive coordinator search continues. The 2025 offseason is officially across college football into day number 2. And the Nittany Lions, of course, are popping up on all sorts of different things. Heisman odds boards, national championship odds boards, too early top 25s for 2025s, final polls for 2024. And so we have a lot to discuss this morning. We'll get to your questions as well. Feel free to leave any in the comment section for us. T. Frank, it is a time of year where there's everything going on and also nothing going on. It is a very fascinating stretch because Penn State will have junior days, as you, Ryan, and Sean Fitz will discuss on the recruiting show tomorrow. So we have recruiting going on, coaches on the road, a coordinator search, but it's a lot of hurry up and wait in some respects at this time of the year. So just general thoughts on where we stand here on January 22nd.
Yeah, so when I was back in my radio days, I coined the term too soon season because you hit August and suddenly there are pumpkin spice lattes and Halloween decorations. And it's like, what are you talking about? School's not even in session yet. Why are we talking about Halloween? And then, Christmas and everything just railroads over each other at the grocery store and at the just when you're out shopping for holidays. This is too soon season for football, where literally the season just ended. Nobody has caught their breath. Nobody has really digested the fact that Ohio State is the national champion, truly all the way. We haven't been given zero time for perspective and look back because that's not interesting. What's interesting is, are you going to be the team in 2025? So I figured it'd be a good time to just stress test some of those conversations, the Heisman odds that are out, and then some of the things that have come out recently about, what it takes to win a national championship. And I thought that was an interesting thing that I wrote about yesterday. So that's kind of the theme of the show, is we're going to react to the reaction, I guess. Yep. And, I don't know if that's what some people love that, right? So this is what the opinion speculation media loves. That's not normally what we do, but we're going to do it in our way. And I think it's going to be interesting and insightful. That's my hope anyway. And of course, Losey's mustache, one of the all-time names, both at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com and here on the YouTube show, asked, hey, when's the mailbag coming back? I'm like, yes, it's going to be back soon. And then I thought to myself, why wait? People are dying to ask questions. They know what they want to know at this time of year. So open the mailbag. We got way too many questions. We're going to get to 5 of them in the mailbag show today. And then, of course, your questions here on the show. So a surprisingly full show as always, because I don't know how to limit myself. I don't know how to structure time. And here we are with another 65 minutes worth of content. We're going to try and get to 60 minutes.
All right. Well, let's dive into it then. Penn State, of course, finishes the year number 5. Finishes the 2024 season, I should say. Number 5 in both the AP Top 25 and the USA Today Coaches Poll. As you note, though, there's no time to look back. We're only going to look ahead. So Penn State in the early top 25s, it came out on Tuesday, which is a day after the national championship game tradition, averaged out to 3.75. So that means obviously most voters had them at either number 3 or number 4. The lowest I saw Penn State was number 6 from RJ Young at Fox Sports. The highest, number 1, Sort Mandel, put the Lions on top at The Athletic. I think that is obviously going with the conversation of Drew Allar on the Heisman Trophy board. If you are a quarterback of a top 5 team, there is a halfway decent chance you are going to be pretty high up on the Heisman Trophy odds boards. And, of course, Drew Allar finds himself there as of this very second. I was looking down a second ago to get the latest odds. He is 12-1, so a $100 bet would win $1,200 to win the Heisman Trophy, tied with Cade Klubnik and Nico Amialava from Tennessee, of course. Garrett Nussmeier from LSU and Arch Manning both at plus 850 lead the list. T. Frank, Drew Allar was on the Heisman odds board a year ago. Never, I don't think, seriously factored into that conversation. But it's a guy who comes back for his final season, we presume, at Penn State. Again, the leader of a top 5, top 3, potentially preseason number 1 college football team. It should be no surprise that he is in the top 3 of the odds board at this point. But the question we're going to discuss here, and I'm fascinated to hear not only what you say, but what everyone says in the chat. If you're listening on replay, let us know over on the Blue White Illustrated message board. But it's not surprising he's there, But
Yeah.
is it realistic for him to end up there and maybe be in New York as a top 3 odds quarterback or player would come December when this ceremony is held later this year?
Rob says awards come with wins, and I disagree with that. I think that it is necessary, but the first thing is, and as Big Spirit says here, Big Ten Spirit says, who catches his passes? Because I don't think you win a Heisman for handing the ball off. It's absolutely right. Stats win awards. Stats win awards. Stats win awards. Stats win awards because people don't watch all the film. It is physically impossible to watch 135 teams or whatever it is every single week and have an objective view on all of these things. So the shortcut is, what's the box score say? Drew Allar has to throw a lot of touchdowns, has to generate a lot of touchdowns, has to generate a lot of yards in order to be a Heisman contender. And a guy like Dylan Gabriel, right? Dylan Gabriel threw a lot of passing yardage last year. But you do have to have a little bit of the eyeball test because a lot of that yardage came on screens. A lot of it was, dumping off to athletic receivers and letting them go do the work. And while the stats work for you, there's the highlight package. And so all of it is important. I think the most interesting aspect of this, though, isn't necessarily can he, but how does he happen? Because, yes, the receivers are the biggest wild card on the entire roster. They're the biggest hole. They're the conversation point about Allar and the opportunity to get there. So I thought it was more interesting to say, like, what does the offense have to look like for him to generate those things? And I do think that in its purest form, this offense could generate a Heisman quarterback, easily could generate a Heisman quarterback. It doesn't have to be all about the running backs. But there's a couple of factors that go into that, Greg, and that's where I think I want to start this discussion.
Yeah, so obviously it goes without saying that the Heisman Trophy winner is typically someone, you're correct, who has high-level stats, but who also has a tremendous number of playmakers around him who, to the Dylan Gabriel example, can make a guy maybe look better than his numbers indicate or should indicate, or maybe that it makes the work that guy's doing look better than it actually is. And so for Penn State, the conversation continues. I think we've been having this for the better part of what feels like a decade. It's not a decade, but it feels like a decade. But it's only been a couple years that the Penn State receivers room has been obviously the big focus of the offseason. So when you look at Heisman Trophy winners, typically they have at least one standout receiver who's probably up for the Biletnikoff Award, which goes to the nation's best pass catcher. Or they have somebody who is making dazzling plays downfield, be it Tyler Warren type guy, a tight end, be it a running back. And so for this Penn State offense, I mean, let's set the table before we get into the conversation about what it needs to look like and who needs to do what. Two guys in, Devontae Ross, all Sunbelt receiver at Troy. Kyron Hudson, key contributor at USC, both come to Penn State via the transfer portal. Trey Wallace leaves via the transfer portal. He goes to Ole Miss, and Omari Evans is off to wherever, we don't know yet. He's visiting Washington as we sit here and talk on 10 a.m. Eastern time on January 22nd. He's gone, not coming back. Julian Fleming, of course, off to chase his pro dream as well. Tyler Johnson, Mekhi Flowers down the depth chart, receivers who have moved on. So I think the obvious question here, T. Frank, and it's one we're going to discuss for the better part of the next 6 months, does Penn State have a receiver or receivers that can help lift not only Penn State to wins against its best opponent, but Drew Allar to the top of this Heisman Trophy conversation once the games start being played in the fall?
Yes, potentially. In terms of, do they have the talent necessary to make that happen? It's a slim margin, but yes, Devontae Ross has the speed and in the right situation can generate those explosive plays down the field. You've got a couple of young up and coming players on the roster from a development standpoint that can generate explosive plays in different ways. And then you have a stable of quality players to generate the consistency you need, a Kyron Hudson, a Khalil Dinkins, for the passing game to sustain. And of course, throwing the ball to Nick Singleton. And, not everyone's going to remember every screen pass that goes for 70 yards, but if he throws in a couple of those, I think that the offensive alchemy is there. And that's the point in the chat where Rob says he'll never have a 27-35 for 389 and 4 touchdowns game. That's not how this offense is constructed. That's absolutely right. But can he have a 4 combined touchdown game with a goal line run for 3 yards or a QB sneak and then 3 passing touchdowns and he's 19 let's say 20 of 25 or 20 of 27 or something like that for 300 yards. We've seen that in this offense. It's about the efficiency and the explosiveness of the passing game. Andy Kotelnicki's offense wants to push the ball down the field and be aggressive with the passing attack. That is something Drew Allar can do, and that is where they fell short despite the improvement from last year. And this is the thing that has to be clearly stated. I was working on something about explosive plays and what it would take for the running game to dominate and get them to a national championship. And the numbers are staggering in terms of the explosive play improvement from 23 to 24. It was absolute. Even if you adjust for the number of games they had last year, I think from a passing perspective, they had 35 more explosive. No, from the running perspective, they had 35 more explosive run plays from last year to 2024. And now it's 2 years ago to 2024. So they were more explosive this year. They were more explosive in the passing game. Drew Allar, despite, kind of where the season ended, averaged over 9 yards per passing attempt or average depth of target. That is much more aggressive. So the ingredients are there. And in its full iteration, if a quarterback could throw the ball and run in the option game, this could be a 5,000-yard quarterback with 3,000 yards passing. Whatever the combination of yards is, 4,000 yards total, and just a boatload of touchdowns. If Allar runs the ball more next year and has some of those rushing touchdowns, it's kind of like the Tyler Warren conversation of he did everything.
Right.
The quarterback in this offense can do everything: RPOs, read option, deep passing, and make a profile for that. So it is not necessarily the offense that's holding it back. It's the implementation of the offense that would hold back Allar from having a Heisman conversation. But ultimately, do they get there? And does he have enough yards consistently to be in the conversation? I agree with the sentiment that this is going to be a run-first offense. It's going to be Nick Singleton, Katron Allen. They don't feature that part of the offense, even though they've got a very talented quarterback. So, I would say Nick Singleton might have a better opportunity of Heisman in 2025 than Drew Allar from a logistical perspective. And that's even considering he's sharing the load with Katron Allen. So, yeah, I don't think that realistically in this offense, despite trying to paint the picture of how it would work, that there's any opportunity for any of these players to have a Heisman candidacy unless something changes. And that's always the caveat is we need to reserve the right for Drew Allar to get better, Andy Kotelnicki to change and tweak things. He has been explicit. He's been explicit in that the talent dictates the offense. The scheme doesn't dictate the talent. And so he's going to learn from what he had this year, and he's going to craft an offense around what he has. And he has a senior quarterback. So that is going to be a part of the offense. The question just is, which one of these two strengths leads the way, given the receiver position is kind of in the conversation. And I know that I've gone on a long time here, but I think Devontae Ross is really important in this picture, because from what I've seen of Andy Kotelnicki, when he's designed explosive plays, they have been around getting an elite speed player in matchup situations, a lot of times in the slot, but not necessarily always, and getting that player one-on-one with an athlete that doesn't have that speed comparison. Ross has that. The question is, can he do it against more than one coverage? Because Amari Evans, as we talked about this offseason, as we started the offseason breakdown and look back at last year, did not have the diversity in his game to win against everybody. And that's going to be the question about Ross. I think there's more opportunity there from what we've seen proven at a lower level, but it is about proving it at this level. Can he get away from everybody in all situations?
A lot of things to unpack there, but Dave, our good friend from Blue White Illustrated, knows how to play this game well. Not waiting for the mailbag segment because he has a super chat donation. So we're going to jump him right to the front of the line. That's how it works here on the BWI Live Show. And it goes to this idea. Who is a standout receiver for Drew next year? So you're talking about Devontae Ross. And obviously, like we said, Dave, thanks for the super chat donation. He is one of the newcomers along with Kyron Hudson, plus 4 class of 2026 guys that I think are getting overlooked, perhaps fairly, perhaps not. But, when I hear people talk about the receiver room makeover, or whatever you want to call it, shakeup.
Yeah.
All the focus is put on the transfers, with good reason. They've done it at this level, but let's not forget there's 4 class of 2026 guys coming, in addition to what is essentially a newcomer in Peter Gonzalez, who's coming off an injury. We don't know when he'll be ready to roll, but at some point this year we expect him to be able to. Josiah Brown's a guy who came to Penn State in the class of 2024 and was, that's right, 4, yeah, and was hurt when he got here and took a redshirt season, and then obviously Tysier Denmark is back too. So look, when you literally return, I think it's like 32 catches for 200 yards or something like that from the receiver position. I think it's tough to sit here and pick your standout receiver for Drew Allar right now. From a go ahead. I'm going to phrase it to you is, from a skill set perspective, who do you think has the best chance to mesh what they do well with what Andy Kotelnicki might have in mind for this offense? And again, a year where we saw last year, he said, Tyler Warren's my best player. I'm going through Tyler Warren. There's a very good chance at this time next year we could be looking back on it and say, Andy Kotelnicki said, Nick Singleton and Katron Allen are my 2 best players. We're going through them.
Yeah, and that's what we saw in the semifinal game against Notre Dame. Is they tried to get the ball to Nick Singleton down the field on a bunch of wheel routes and a bunch of different concepts. He was one of the first targets in the game on a screen pass. That was the plan, was to single him in coverage, in man coverage, and attack a weakness, which was linebackers. The problem was they couldn't connect on those plays. So I would say that's a part of where I'm starting for 2025. And I think both players can benefit from that, talking about Drew Allar. And let's just kind of spin away from the conversation of the Heisman conversation. Let's just talk about successful football here. Both players are needed in that environment, right? To throw the ball down the field to a running back that is a more valuable target than just a swing pass out of the backfield. Yeah. I would prefer that in an offense, because if it's 1,000 screen and swing passes, I'm going to get real bored with football next year. So I do think that is a valuable and viable part of what we should expect next year. But then it does become who is the most consistent in the way that they perform. Andy Kotelnicki talked about it's on him as a coach to not put guys in position to fail. Like, if I'm asking a guy to do something and he can't do it reliably, it's not his fault. I shouldn't be asking him to do that. So what can you reliably do? And that becomes the bulk of what the offense does. So, from Kyron Hudson's perspective, we've seen him as a really solid contested catch player, but not a guy that separates well. So how do you feature that? Devontae Ross, I think it's going to, let me just shorten this answer. It's going to come down to, in my opinion, that combination of who's the Z and who's the slot between Tysier Denmark and Devontae Ross. And I know that Liam Clifford is going to play, and Penn State fans don't want to hear about that. He's going to be in the rotation. He's absolutely, for sure. They want reliable people out there, especially as a blocker. And 6'1", 200 is better than 5'10", 185. And
did it well this year.
And did it well.
I know, again, no one cares, but he did do it well. The primary reason to be out there is not necessarily it's catch passes, of course, but run blocked very well. And Penn State, if they do go the way we think they're going to likely go on offense, we'll need that again this year, for sure.
Yes. Yeah, and that is a problem when we're talking about one of your starting 4 receivers. And last year, 2 of your starting 5 receivers or 4 receivers is like, well, they're really good run blockers. That's like talking about effort in a scouting report, which is like, oh, no, we're not talking about speed, size, quickness, agility, power. We're talking about how hard he's running, because he's got to run really hard to catch up with everybody. And so that is something that needs to be addressed. But I think in the conversation about who's featured how and why, it is situational of, can Devontae Ross win outside as the outside Z receiver, where he's on the line of scrimmage, he's got to beat press coverage, he's got to beat guys with his athleticism, because he doesn't have the size to win a hand battle at this point. He can always get bigger and stronger, but what we've seen from him on film, I'm not expecting him to come out as a 200-pound Tyreek Hill clone, because people don't realize Tyreek Hill's like 195. He's a tank. I played running back at Oklahoma State to start his career. And then from Denmark's perspective, does he play outside as the more physical of those 2 guys that are slightly undersized, or does he play in the slot and use his agility and athleticism in two-way go situations to get open? And how do they feature those talents? Those are the difference-making talents at the receiver position from those two guys. And then everything else is going to be an add-on bonus. If a Peter Gonzalez develops, if Josiah Brown gives you something, those are things that we haven't really seen tangibly yet that you're hoping for, but I don't want to sit here in January and assume any of those things.
I think another part of this conversation, it's come up a couple times in the chat, I'll highlight this comment quick, is how Drew plays against Oregon and Ohio State will be a big factor in any Heisman conversation. It's not just the big factor, I should say, in the Heisman Trophy conversation for Drew Allar. It's the biggest factor in how this team is going to be perceived in 2025. Look, I think there are going to be people that look at the start of this Penn State schedule. It's horrible. Nevada, FIU, Villanova.
Yeah.
I was just pulling up Bill Connolly's latest final SP Plus rankings of the year. And if you keep wondering why I look down, if you're not a frequent viewer of the show, if I have too many tabs open, the computer stops working, so I'm using my phone to try and mitigate that fact.
I love you working around this. The adaptation is phenomenal. I'd love a plugged-in connection, but I know we're all working with the limitations we have.
Yes. So it's either the fifth TV for NFL Sundays or the plugged-in connection, T. Frank, and I just got to go with the fifth TV for now. I'm only half joking. But so Penn State starts its season non-conference games with FIU, Villanova, and Nevada. Nevada, of course, being the home opener on August 30th, 220 days from now. Then a bye week. Then it hosts Oregon. And so people are going to rightfully come into that Oregon game saying, okay, what is this Penn State team? Is it really as good? Because it's going to be somewhere between numbers 1 and 5 in the rankings when that game rolls around. Unless they somehow lose to one of those three teams, which we're going to be having a much different conversation if that ends up being the case. But yes, that Oregon game for Penn State and for Drew Allar will be the first time to put the hype, so to speak, up against a program that's actually pretty good. And, you know, again, I'm not trying to be totally disrespectful of FIU, Villanova, and Nevada, but good luck. You could spend probably a week trying to find a worse non-conference schedule, and I'm not sure you would. It is bad. And so no one's going to be totally bought in on any Penn State hype, no matter what Penn State does. If Allar throws 6 touchdowns a game, or if Nick Singleton and Katron Allen each score 3 times a game in that non-conference slate, everyone's just going to shrug. And so, yes, the performance against Oregon and then later in the year against Ohio State, but specifically against Oregon to sort of set the tempo for October and that, you know, towards the second half of the season, it's a huge game for Penn State. So we obviously have months and months to talk about that, but I thought it was a fair point that for Penn State, this schedule overall, I mean, I know we talked about the quote-unquote dream draw ad nauseum about Penn State and its path in the college football playoff. Let me tell you, this regular season draw for Penn State is about as good as you could hope for. You have Oregon, of course, at home. You have to go to UCLA. Could be tougher this year. I thought they rebounded pretty nicely, but it should be a win. You host Northwestern. You could argue that the toughest stretch of the season is at Iowa, at Ohio State, but you have a bye in between there. You get Indiana at home. You go to Michigan State, and you close things out with Nebraska. You don't have all of the heavy hitters by any stretch of the imagination in the Big Ten. So, there's no doubt that not only Drew Allar's Heisman Trophy outlook, but also Penn State's outlook and how Penn State is perceived will be largely built, T. Frank, around those two games, which makes it just like every other season, pre-expansion or not.
Yeah, like the stratification of college football is nearing its completion where you have, and this is probably a little bit of hyperbole here because that's what I do. It's just a sprinkle of hyperbole. There aren't teams that have Penn State's institutional advantages outside of the ones that have more institutional advantages than Penn State. That's why in kind of my feeling about that game with Notre Dame was Penn State was the team that should have won that game. It's one of the few times we've seen James Franklin lose a game against a team he should have beaten. And I understand that they're in an equal stratosphere, but that's the point, is they were in an equal stratosphere from all of those things. It's rare that we get a combination of teams that have that level of consistency between the two. So that's I think the conversation about the end of this past season and what they're setting up for next year, which is none of these teams have the same level of talent other than the ones that potentially have more talent. So Penn State has to find a way through being in purgatory, and they haven't yet found their way through purgatory. I'll be interested to see if they can continually throw money at it for long enough to actually break through.
We'll have to wait and see on that. Ryan, another donation, super chat to the channel. Thank you so much. You're a long time and frequent listener. We appreciate it. Drew has the talent, he says, in terms of the Heisman Trophy conversation, but needs to scheme better wide receiver use. Yeah, that's going to be a part of the conversation all offseason long. And I think that it's going to make spring practice so interesting because unlike, I don't want to say every other year, but I think in terms of most years, we see Penn State and we're focused on, well, recently it's been receivers, but, we're focused on usually the offense. And is the offense going to be good enough to help Penn State's defense take its next step? But now we go into a spring practice where the defense is going to have a new coordinator. And it's also going to be replacing an All-American. Offense obviously is too. But I'll be very interested to see if once we get to spring practice, if all of this talk, it's going to obviously still be a part of the conversation, but if all the talk still focuses on receiver, Drew Allar, or if we get more of a balance from the fan base. And you guys will let us know in the comment section. I have no doubts about that, but just curious to see how that all unfolds here as we move forward.
Yeah. Do you want to get to your 4 things from yesterday, your 4 thoughts? That was something that I thought was a good baseline of setting the expectations and the thoughts for the upcoming year.
Yeah, so let's do that. Just as a programming note, if you're watching on YouTube, I have a dog down here with me now, so that's not a part of the show equation, but he's here, so just ignore me if you see me trying to mind him as we get through the rest of this show. One quick thing from the chat, because it's come up a couple times. I can't find it. It's here somewhere. There's a question about what the whiteout game is. We don't know yet. Penn State has not announced that game yet. I mean, I think if you look at the home schedule, Frank, this will be. We'll use this. We'll use this as one of the 4, and we'll get rid of. It can kind of blend with the 4th one on that list. But, you look at the schedule this year and you think about the terms, the things that are going to define Penn State's season. Obviously, in the spring here, we have the countdown to spring practice, and then we have the countdown to the spring transfer portal window. And then it'll be the countdown to the regular season. And along the way, obviously, the whiteout game always plays a big role in Penn State's season. We'll learn that later this year. You look at the home schedule to me, Frank, and I don't know how it's not Oregon. Genuinely, I can't fathom how it is not Oregon for a couple of reasons. One, it makes too much sense to put it in prime time. Yes, I realize you're going to start typing Fox Noon in the chat. I get it.
I know where you're going, and I love it.
Yes, but I don't think Fox and the Big Ten are going to let one of their premier programs play a 9 o'clock body time. They didn't care if they did it to UCLA. They didn't care if they made Rutgers play at UCLA at 11 o'clock Eastern time. I think they will care about about Oregon. So in a way, they didn't care about Rutgers. So I think that they will make that game a primetime matchup on NBC. It'll be the whiteout game in September. It's not official. Like I said, they have not made that announcement yet. It would be stunning unless they are informed that Fox is taking this game for a noon game, which I just cannot believe is going to be the case. It'll be shocking if the whiteout game is anything but Penn State, Oregon in September. I would be stunned, otherwise.
Yeah.
Let's get into the 4 things. I wrote this yesterday at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. It was 221 days to kickoff. We now have 220 to go until Penn State opens the 2025 season by hosting Nevada, the first ever meeting between the 2 schools at Beaver Stadium. Time and TV details, of course, not yet out at this early juncture. It's only January. It feels like we're moving ahead at warp speed towards the new season, but of course, we're not quite there yet. So we covered most of the top question facing the Penn State offense, which of course is receivers. But I want to blend this and get your opinion on something that came up in the mailbag section. You said we were only going to get to 5 questions. We are. We're just going to get to more as we blend them throughout the show here. But
perfect.
Your thoughts on the, because obviously, question number 1 is, can the receivers be better? I get it. That's going to be the dominating factor. It's why we spent almost 30 minutes talking about it here today. But tight end, you're replacing an All-American. You return Khalil Dinkins, who played some behind Tyler Warren this year, but Tyler Warren was the guy and played the appropriate amount of snaps as the guy. So the question becomes, who is that Tyler Warren rep taker this year, or do they go back to a more balanced approach at tight end with the number of returners they have, plus they bring in Andrew Olesh from the class of 2025. So I'm curious your initial thoughts on how you think the rep count there is going to break down.
Yeah, I'll throw this up here now. This is from Townsend. Interesting to get your guys' opinion on how you think Kotelnicki will manage the tight end position, and you kind of just laid out the point. There has been balanced use in the past, but there's always been a number 1 guy. The part that obscures that is at one point Theo Johnson got hurt. So Tyler Warren kind of stepped into the void for a while for Theo Johnson, but it's always there has been a rhythm of it. Was Pat Freiermuth, and then guys behind him, Bretton Strange, then it was Bretton Strange, then it was Theo Johnson, then it was Tyler Warren, but Tyler Warren became the focal point of the entire offense, not just the tight end room. And so it is a balance of what's the focus of the offense and then what's the focus of the tight end room. I still think there's going to be a guy. And what we saw from Khalil Dinkins this past year, I know Tyler Warren gets the love because he did everything, right? So he was the receiver that then was shoving a guy 10 yards out of bounds against defensive ends against SMU in the playoff. The more consistent run blocker and the better overall run blocker was Khalil Dinkins. And that blew my mind because, he came in with a profile of this is a athlete playing tight end as a guy that was a favorite receiver in the red zone for Drew Allar in 2023. They try to play him at X basically in the Peach Bowl. And then suddenly he's the lead blocking tight end. He's going to get the opportunity to do both this year, in my opinion. That's where I'm starting. And then it becomes who evolves in these positions and in these situations, because people are forgetting how excited everyone was for Andrew Rappelier before he got hurt.
Correct.
So Luke Reynolds was playing as a freshman because Andrew Rappelier got hurt. Now, that doesn't guarantee that Andrew Rappelier is going to get his spot back. It also doesn't mean that just because he wants to play, Andrew Olesh is going to find a role on this team. You have to be above and beyond better than a veteran in the mental capacity as well as the physical capacity, going back to can you continually do it consistently instead of can you do it every once in a while. So I don't know that Khalil Dinkins is going to get the Tyler Warren treatment of you've got to get him the football 6 times every game. But I do think if I'm starting with the 2025 template, it's Dinkins and then those 3 players fighting for the roles behind him, because he's proven on a lot of different levels he's the reliable one that should get the first opportunity to replace Tyler Warren. And they have generally gone veterans ahead of freshmen. But, any rule has its examples and its exceptions.
Yeah. Khalil Dinkins is a guy that's been talked about in very high regard from those within the program, even though he did not have Tyler Warren level reps, because Tyler Warren had Tyler Warren level reps. But curious when he gets, I mean, let's be honest. I wouldn't say we looked at Tyler Warren the same way we looked at Khalil, at this time last year, the same way we're looking at Khalil Dinkins now. But I want to take you back to this time last year. There was no one, I refuse to believe, anyone who thought Tyler Warren would end up being the player he became in 2024.
Yeah.
To the level. I mean, not that people didn't think that he could be a big part of the offense and things like that, but if you thought he was going to snap the ball and catch a touchdown, if you thought he was going to be Penn State's primary short yardage rusher, if you thought he was going to outpace, probably have the target numbers.
Players.
Yeah, one of the best players in the country.
And be one of their best runners. Yeah.
Right.
Like he follows blocks better than some of their receivers. We are totally off right now, Greg. I must be like a full second behind or something.
It's always something. I blame the tabs, even though I don't have any open. But at this point, I think that we'll see. Khalil Dinkins certainly has all the makeup of a guy who could take a big step forward. It would be totally unfair to say he's going to make a Tyler Warren-like leap. But I do think, T. Frank, that there's no question that Penn State is tremendously stocked in the tight ends room. And no matter who steps up, we know and can feel pretty comfortably that somebody is going to step up into that role that Penn State will need in 2025.
So I want to just throw this in here when we're talking about tight ends, receivers, the offense in general. It is a new coordinator, so it's important to put the context in these things.
Right.
2021, the first year that Mike Yurcich was at Penn State, Jahan Dotson got 137 targets. Next was Parker Washington, 86. Keandre Lambert-Smith, 59. You'll also remember that was the year they couldn't run the football. They just could not run the football whatsoever. They had issues on the offensive line. They had talent issues at running back without, explosive playmakers. Noah Cain was injured, coming back and not playing at 100%. Kevon Lee, John Lovett was the explosive back, right?
Kevon Lee, new UNLV running back. I don't know if you missed that in the transfer portal yesterday. Yeah, he's leaving Mississippi State and going to play for Dan Mullen at UNLV. His career continues.
So, yeah, a 2-time transfer and a guy that was a rotational player at LSU were your starting running backs in 2021. So the next 2 seasons, Penn State with Mike Yurcich goes through these evolutions of going away from throwing 1,000 screen passes to Jahan Dotson because that was a better running play than it was anything else. But 137 targets. Do you know, you just brought this up, do you know how many Tyler Warren had this past year at tight end?
I don't, a lot. I'm going to go with a lot.
135.
Yeah.
So that's what we're talking about. Compensating for a lack of receiver participation through spamming the tight end. And that doesn't even count his running plays, right? His direct snaps, his passing snaps. So it was a titanic shift to one player. I don't expect that in 2025 because there is not anybody right now on the roster that demands 135 targets.
Correct.
So how does all this work out? Whether it's 3 tight ends get that many or it's 1 receiver, you can't function a team with Nick Singleton getting 135 targets from the running back position. You will lose so many football games. That is just impossible. And if we're saying they're going to build the team around the running backs, then targets are wide open right now. So receivers, tight ends, running backs, everyone has the opportunity. I expect it to be an approach of throwing to the masses this upcoming season because that's what they have. And I think that's a better opportunity to scheme a diverse number of players into the offense.
And so we'll see if Penn State is able to do that. Obviously, it will be a big talking point all offseason long and a big have a big impact on how they perform in 2025. Flipping over to the other side of the ball, big question facing the Penn State defense 220 days from kickoff with Nevada. Eventually, it's what I wrote yesterday. Eventually, we're going to be able to have the conversation about who replaces Abdul Carter's production. Who is the middle linebacker now that Kobe King is gone? Who plays next to Zachy Wheatley at safety? Eventually, we're going to have all of those conversations. But until Penn State picks a new defensive coordinator, they're not impossible to have, but it's not, you can't cement anything, obviously, without having the guy in place who's going to make the final decision. So, Penn State defensive coordinator search, clearly the top of mind for the defensive side of the ball at this juncture. As we talk on 10:37 on January 22nd Eastern Time. No decision made yet. No hire announced. Stay tuned over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. We have the latest news updates on this search over there. It's $1 for 7 days. So join us over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com to learn the latest on the Penn State defensive coordinator search, which at this point could wrap up at any moment. Today, tomorrow, Friday, Saturday, next week. Don't know. But there's what it goes without saying, T. Frank, that Penn State has questions to answer on defense, starting with who's going to be calling the plays. And so I think you can talk about all those other things. I know that one of the questions we had for the mailbag was about the middle linebacker setup. And again, I just think until you know what kind of play caller you're going to have, we can assume the defense will be fairly consistent to what Penn State's played under James Franklin. That's much as obvious. But you can go in a lot of different directions based on who the actual final answer is. So I don't want to get too far into the weeds. But one of the questions we got while we're on this topic, I don't know if you cut this one or not, but I'm going to find out in real time.
Sure. You mean from the mailbag?
I do, yeah. Who is the player on the defensive line that we will be talking about in December as a potential first-round pick? That question comes from OC Lion over on the Blue White Illustrated Lions Den message board. I mean, it has to be. Well, I guess there's 2 options here, and I'll let you pick. It's either Dani Dennis Sutton or it's Zane Durant. I don't think at this juncture you could conceivably or with good conscience pick any other Penn State defensive lineman to project as a potential first-round NFL draft pick. Yeah. And it has to be Dani, right? I mean, it has to be Dani.
This is the thing is the answer to the question is none, in my opinion.
Fair.
I have always seen Dani as the 38th overall pick. You know, that's where I think he can be, what he can become. And that is maybe unfair, and maybe that is precluding the best possible outcome for him. But it is partially about the way he plays the game. He's not a speed rusher, and he's not an elite bender to the quarterback. He doesn't bend the corner especially well. And we've seen him try and work on it for 3 years now, and it has not yielded tangible results on the field in terms of how he plays, the way he plays. So those things from a size perspective, yeah, first round draft pick if he played like Abdul Carter from a performance perspective. But can he be an elite pass rusher who wins with his hands and is a guy that is wildly productive? Yeah. Yes, he can. He can be one of the best defensive ends in America. But we're talking about the NFL draft, which is a different criteria than can he be great. It is, a first round draft pick is all of it. And so I don't necessarily see that from his profile. And that's been kind of the way I've seen him since he was a 5-star prospect. Like, that's kind of, just how I've tried to understand the way he plays and try to give the context and nuance to his game. Zane Durant is the guy, to me, that has the better opportunity to be a first-round draft pick, because from a physical perspective, he's going to blow your mind at the combine if he puts up similar stuff that what we've reported at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, some of the context that we have about his athletic skills and what you see on the field. The question is going to be, at 290 pounds, is he Aaron Donald or Ed Oliver? And Ed Oliver, here's the part about Ed Oliver from Houston. He played nose tackle. So he was taking on double teams, and he was proving as an undersized defensive lineman without extensive length. Like, he doesn't have 33-inch arms, and neither does Zane Durant. He doesn't have that elite prototype length that Aaron Donald had. Yeah. And we're comparing them to the guy that was the 13th overall pick and was one of the greatest defensive tackles in modern NFL history, because that's the way he has to play. Right. Other guys like Milton Williams went in the 3rd round. Now, I think he's better than that, because I think, again, he's going to be the 34th overall pick or the 37th overall pick, somewhere in there. Like, that's where I think he should be aiming. And so could he get into the 1st round if he proves that he is an unblockable pass rusher in addition to his disruption in the run game? I actually think he's where he needs to be as a run defender. It's the fact that he doesn't get consistent elite production from either sacks or pressures. That is what he needs to work on this year. So of the two, I would say it's to me, it's Zane Durant of the guys that could be a 1st-round draft pick. But again, the size part of that, he's going to have to be unquestionably elite to the point that he's going to translate to not just a good player in the NFL, but a cornerstone 3 technique that you build your defense around if you're a 1-gap penetrating 4 down front.
All right. Well, it's a good segue. The final 2 of the 4 things just focused on the fact that expectations obviously are very high for Penn State this year with good reason, and that if 220 days till kickoff is too far away for you, it's 94 days until the blue-white game. So we can use that shortened timeline as something to hold on to as the light at the end of the tunnel on this long march to the 2025 season. But let's transition this conversation. T. Frank made a good segue for that into a look at Penn State's draft talent for 2025, which would be the 2026 NFL draft, and whether the Nittany Lions have enough of it to make a run at not just winning as many regular season games as possible, but also the 2026 College Football Playoff National Championship. So Jim Nagy, who runs the Senior Bowl, is sort of the jumping off point for this conversation. You pressed the button first. Nicely done, T. Frank. He says this marks the 6th straight year where schools with the most NFL draft picks win the FBS title. Sunday Talent wins. 2020 was LSU with 14. 2021 Alabama had 10. 2022 and 2023 Georgia had 15 and 10. Michigan 13 last year. And he says, trust us that Ohio State is going to have the most drafted players in the 2025 NFL draft. So the question to you, T. Frank, and I'll be curious not only to hear your thoughts, but see what those in the chat have to say, is does Penn State, as its roster currently is constructed, have enough NFL draft caliber talent to win the national championship? That's a great way to phrase this question. Yeah, go ahead.
Important context here so I wrote about this at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. I outlined the number of players and the names and the people that are in that conversation. It's about guys that can go in the 26th draft, not do they have NFL talent. So Andrew Olesh is not part of the conversation. Luke Reynolds is not part of the conversation because it's guys. This is specifically, he's saying guys that get drafted immediately after the national championship game. The number of veterans and NFL level veterans on your team that are producing at NFL levels. And that doesn't mean first round draft pick, by the way. It means, do you get drafted? So seventh round counts the same as first round. Now, obviously, from the field perspective and the on-field production perspective, it is weighted, right? They're not all made the same. But if we're talking pure numbers here, the cold hard math, you have to be a draftable player in 2026. And that list is not 30 players long.
How many players long is it, T. Frank? I mean, in your mind, do you think it is? So as you note, I'll put this graphic back up if you're watching on the YouTube channel. If you look at the number of players drafted on these teams, the high, as we currently sit here, is 15 players from the 2022 Georgia team that won the national championship were drafted. The low, Alabama and Georgia both had 10 players drafted after winning the 2020 and 2022 national titles. So does Penn State have somewhere between 10 and 15 draft potential players this year in your mind?
So to your point, I set the threshold at 10, and Penn State has 7 at the moment. I would say that our draftable players that are going to go in the 2026 NFL draft, whether they can or not, right? So we are actually in the position, Greg, where guys don't have COVID eligibility that make me confused. So a guy like Drew Shelton, this is his last year, right? Like, he has to have an NFL year because there's no coming back and improving upon his stock. I do have that right. I'm still gun shy about making these declarations here in January. But he played as a freshman. I will look
while you talk, but that sounds correct to me, yes.
Yeah, okay, so he played as a freshman. Yeah. So there are 7 total, and you can go read the article, and I broke it down by the players. Here's the good news is, off the bat, no. They have 5 on offense, and they have 2 on defense. And spoiler alert, they're the 2 guys we just talked about in Zane Durant and Dennis Sutton. But guys jump onto the radar with great seasons. And so there are enough. Yes, the answer is yes, they do have enough NFL level talent that can be drafted next year, but guys have to develop. There are certain players that have to work their way onto this list. And here's a guy that I think is a perfect example, Khalil Dinkins. We already talked about him here on the show, where he is a guy that's going to get the opportunity to be the next Penn State tight end. And I think Penn State is going to give him the opportunity to prove he's a Brenton Strange type, who in his final season proved he could be the guy. And the Jaguars made the surprise pick of making him a second-round draft pick, which, again, if you were to go into the draft and you would say at that time, is Brenton Strange a second-round draft pick? No. He was probably in the 4th. And the fact that he and Theo Johnson flipped places, I think, is just hilarious, given the NFL draft is usually about height, weight, speed, talent, and then, your positional ability later. I'm not saying it was wrong. I actually think that Brenton Strange is playing well for the Jaguars, and they made a smart move. But the draft positioning and all of those things is what we're talking about here for guys that need to make it so that they are a no doubt draftable player in the opportunity of 2025. So there's a couple of other situations that I want to highlight. So I'm not going to give you all those names, but another situation is the right tackle position. Because at his best, Anthony Donko is a 3-year player, right? In terms of the talent level he has to play tackle and the development curve he was on before he got injured. But he got injured. Right. So what's his production? What is his health next year? And because we don't expect either Nolan Rucci or Anthony Donko to play another position unless somebody gets hurt, and then we're having a conversation about Drew Shelton, and he's not a draftable player at that point, right? So there is a zero sum on the offensive line. I have it as either Anthony Donko or Nolan Rucci, depending on health and performance. But I think Nolan Rucci played well enough this year to prove that he, like, from a talent perspective, he's obviously an NFL offensive lineman. And he's developed to the point that if he does it, he develops again this next offseason, he can be a draftable player. But both can't, because you need the reps on film, and you're not drafting a guy off of speculation as much anymore on talent. Now, any of these things can happen. Penn State could have 2 right tackles drafted in the same draft. That is possible, but unlikely. So there are things that need to play out, especially on the defensive side of the ball, where guys have to get better and they have to play up to a certain threshold to prove they're draftable. So another name I'll give you is Zakee Wheatley. I think Zakee Wheatley, from an instincts perspective and from a football perspective, can play in the NFL. He will play in the NFL. But is he getting drafted? That's the conversation here. Did he play well enough that a team goes, okay, he might not be the best athlete in the world, but in our defense, he can play and make plays and get his hands on the football. Those are things that have to play out, and that will determine whether Penn State wins or loses a national championship. But they do not have boat racing talent on this roster to immediately get like the pass into the championship game the way that the best teams do, Ohio State and et cetera, et cetera.
Very interesting to see all this play out. And, of course, I think Wheatley's probably the one guy I would slightly disagree with you on. I know where you're coming from. I think he's definitely a surefire draft guy. But either way, I think you're right that Penn State is in a situation where it's not going to enter the year with, at least maybe not at this juncture. We'll see as things progress. But does not seem likely to enter the year with 10 surefire, yes, they are 100% going to get drafted candidates. Yeah. And Penn State has had a lot of guys drafted over the course of the James Franklin era. It's never hit 10. Yeah. So this would have to be an outlier from that perspective as well.
Yeah, so just to continue the conversation on Wheatley, and I want to make this a fully clear picture.
Yeah.
First off, I've been a fan of Zakee Wheatley's ability for a while in terms of the way he plays the game, the instincts, the anticipation he plays with. I thought Jaquan Brisker was worthy of a first-round draft pick because he plays with the speed and size and has the full thing. But he did not put a great combine together. Because, I asked him after the combine, it looked like he tweaked his back. He said he tweaked his back doing the bench press and he didn't run his best. KJ Winston is one of the best athletes we've seen at safety. He's probably going in at best right now without a full season of film this year. He's going in the second round. Safety's a hard position to be valued highly. And then when you get into the late rounds, it's about preference. So if Wheatley goes and he's got a 4th round or a 5th round grade, he could go in the 7th because it's just about need and fit and priority. And safety is not a high priority position from an athletic perspective. You don't need to invest high resources in a safety because guys like, I hate to always do this, DeMar Hamlin and Taylor Rapp are the starting safeties for the Buffalo Bills in the AFC Championship game. They are not the athletes of a Jaquan Brisker or a KJ Winston. I really wish they would pick some of those guys up, though, because, it's going to be a problem once again when you see Travis Kelce wide the hell open next weekend. That's not what we're doing here on the show, though.
You don't want to go down that route? We could talk little Eagles, Bills?
No,
I'm kidding.
No.
We'll do that some other time. We're running into the final stretch here of the BWI Live Show, Wednesday, January 22nd. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickle from Blue White Illustrated, where it's $1 for 7 days of access. Check us out over there, bluewhiteillustrated.com. Also, don't forget, like and subscribe here on the YouTube channel. It helps us out a lot. Leave us a review if you're listening to the podcast version of this. We would greatly appreciate it. But we did promise it, T. Frank, at the top of the show, that we would get to some mailbag questions to close things out here on a Wednesday morning, a chilly Wednesday morning, but a fine Wednesday otherwise beyond that. Let's get to this.
You want me to hit the button? Let me hit the button. I want to hit the intro.
Oh, that's right. We'll do that first. Go ahead. I forgot we had an intro.
Sorry.
Yep, go for it.
This is my favorite intro, so I got to play it. Thank you for letting me waste everybody's time. I appreciate that.
You got it. If you're not watching on YouTube, as it says, the BWI Mailbag is open. And the first question we are pulling out of our bag of mail is this. The projected too deep for the linebacker positions next year. So Penn State goes into the 2025 season, of course, losing Kobe King to the NFL draft. But it gets Dom DeLuca back. Tony Rojas is back. And it's a position group that had a really interesting, I think, 2024 season. Because we talked a lot at times this year about depth being an issue for Penn State at linebacker. And it was trying to develop depth. And you moved Akari Nelson to linebacker. And so obviously you have some underclassmen who are, got their feet wet to some degree in 2024. First question, are you worried about the linebacker depth? Now, second question, just your general thoughts on what the too deep could look like.
I have no idea. I mean, he asked the one question I think is an unknowable at this point. And Dave he's all in on the conversations we're having. We had this conversation yesterday on the show and then on the message board. So it's a great question. I have no clue at this point. Keon Wiley, Dom DeLuca.
Yep.
Tony Rojas.
Dakari Nelson.
That's about where I stop. That's about where I stop of guys that I think are going to play. So am I missing somebody on that conversation of guys that we know are going to play? And so it's who do you trust to have on the field? Who do you trust to have the green dot? And then how does the rest of the mix work together to get you 5 or 6 linebackers? And then, of course, we have the conversation about the defense coordinator. What is their preference of base defense? So I think you've got a couple of Tamir Robinson has to play this upcoming season. Like in terms of I don't want to say it's make or break time because guys have whatever road they are on in terms of their development curve. But for Penn State, it's really important that one of these young linebackers steps up. And Tamir Robinson fixes a lot of problems. If you could get him up to speed where he can play will linebacker, you can then do the same thing where you have Dom DeLuca at moonlighting between two positions and really being that kind of fix-it guy. And then Tony Rojas, I think you could move him to Mike. You can play a Keon Wiley. I don't know. I'll say I really want Tony Rojas to stay at will. And I would like somebody else to step up at Mike linebacker. And to me, that's Keon Wiley. But then you're kind of at a logjam of it's Keon Wiley and at middle linebacker. Rojas, Robinson, Kari Jackson, Anthony Specca. There are names and options, but I don't see a number 2 right now or a number 1 that is clear enough to then fill in the pieces elsewhere. And so that's going to be where do the talents line up and how do they fix everything with that depth that they have of players they've brought in recently. And I just, at this point, I don't know. And I know that was way too long to say I don't know at the end in terms of how long I talked, but those are the problems facing at least me, not knowing what Penn State coaching staff thinks right now in January.
Yeah, that's one of those ones we're going to have to wait. Like we talked about a little bit earlier on the show, some of these questions, until they get a defensive coordinator in place, are just going to be hard to answer. That's just sort of the way it breaks at this time of the year. Next question in the mailbag. Scott, best chance for a breakout year in 2025? And he gives us 4 options to pick from. Receiver Tysier Denmark, linebacker Dakari Nelson, tight end Andrew Olish, or defensive end Max Granville. T. Frank, those are your 4 options, but you are welcome to go off the board. Scott, sorry, I don't know if that was okay with you, but we're going to change the rules here a little bit if T. Frank so desires. So your picks for him are Denmark, Nelson, Olish, and Granville, and you can open the floor with a different bid if you so desire.
I mean, Greg, it has to be Denmark, right? We're talking about opportunity, desperately needing somebody to play receiver in an impactful way. And defensive end feels a little more certain. To me, the two options are Granville or Denmark on that particular list. I would also say Dejon Lane needs to be a part of the conversation because he didn't have a breakout in 2024. So is that 2025? It's a very easy competition in terms of understanding him and King Mack. Those are the guys that are going to probably split time at that field safety position as of right now, unless they want to accelerate Lane to the boundary, which I doubt. So, yeah, I would say of those 4 options, the only 2 that I have serious consideration are Granville and Denmark because they've accelerated Granville on his trajectory multiple times. And then I don't know if you want to throw in other guys that played other positions. Greg, is there anybody off the board you were thinking of?
Well, let's see. I mean, let's just throw some names out there. I'm just saying candidates potentially, and we can kick it around from there. In the running back room, you have Quentin Martin and Corey Smith. Mm-hmm. At receiver, you mentioned Denmark, and I think it'd probably be fair to throw Peter. If we're just talking young guys, Peter Gonzalez on there, assuming he comes back healthy. Tight end, I think Luke Reynolds is the obvious place to start there in terms of a breakout guy, which it feels weird for a guy that played, I think, in all 16 games to say he could have a breakout year. But from a statistical perspective, certainly could.
That's my challenge with this, too. Yeah,
I think that covers a lot of it on offense. Defensively, I think, the bidding for everyone's going to start with Max Granville. Lane is the obvious number 2 in that conversation. You look across the rest of the defense, I think when you go to cornerback, they really like John Mitchell and Kenny Wosley. They would have traveled both guys if they didn't want to preserve their red shirt. So you have those 2 as candidates to look out for at cornerback. And then in the middle of the field, you'd probably put Specca there and Keon Wiley as well. So I think those are your candidates. And I think, to make it easy, Denmark and Granville would be the obvious top 2 picks for, I think, anyone if you were filling this out from just a purely likelihood perspective, because you have a guy in Denmark who Everyone thinks he's ready to take the next step. Yeah, Belgrave's shorter. Brad throws in the chat. That's fair too.
Yeah. Again, that's opportunity driven. He's
right.
He played field safety last year, and I think that they're going to move him to safety. So he's going to be behind Lane and King Mack in that conversation, unless he can earn snaps in the slot. Like as a former corner who has the size and physicality, can he be that lion position, which would be wildly rare for a young player, let alone a guy who hasn't played safety yet.
Right. And then Brad also, sorry, knocked over my microphone there. Also throws in the chat Matthew Alton, the receiver from the class of 2025. Yeah, probably the fact that he's here at Penn State already, I believe he was an early enrollee. That's correct. But I better fact check that. But
I don't think he.
Yeah.
He was not on campus with the receivers when we were there during practice for the bowl games. It was Kobe Howard, and Lyric Samuel.
Yes. Yeah, so I think I am a little leery of throwing any receiver, first-year guy, on the breakout list because, Brad, I think you were probably among them. You can tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I am, who convinced that Tyser Denmark would break out this year, and it obviously did not happen. So I'm a little gun-shy, a little leery to throw a true freshman receiver on that list. But from an opportunity perspective, yes. The opportunity
and a size, athleticism standpoint, right. I do think that that's part of the conversation too.
All right, T. Frank. I think that covered all that we. Did I miss any questions that we had? I think we covered the other two earlier in the show. Did I take a peek
the receiver breakdown was that part of the conversation?
That was the last one. Yeah. So we'll close this out. With some X and O's film talk from T. Frank. Joe asked, "I'd like a good explanation of the different receiver positions and what's expected, specifically the X receiver and the Z receiver." T. Frank, I'll let you run with this however you desire.
Yeah, so this is going to be very general, not specific to Penn State, but just very general in the understanding of the three positions. There's the X, the Z, and the slot. The X and the Z play on the outside of the formation. The X is away from the tight end, typically into the boundary, because you don't usually do formation into the boundary. The boundary is the short side of the field. So the X is alone on one side of the formation, typically. The Z and the slot are to the field, the long side. And those guys, from a general perspective, the X plays a lot of single coverage into the boundary because of the way that you have to shade towards the field. So you get more one-on-one opportunities. You need a bigger physical guy to get off the line of scrimmage. There's a lot more press, even in zones, to that short side of the field because you're in a smaller box. You have to fight with the defensive back a little bit more. So bigger physical guys. Trey Wallace was the X this past year. I would expect Kyron Hudson in these examples to be the X coming up. The Z receiver, typically teams run to the field side. So the long side of the field, just basic averages. So the Z needs to be a good run blocker, but is also can be that deep threat, kind of a specific deep threat in the offense to run. There's more space on that side of the field from a perspective. If you've got more zones, you need a guy that's a well-rounded player out there that can do a little bit of everything and isn't necessarily your go-to guy to win against single coverage, but can be kind of a deep threat, run block. Usually a guy with a height, weight, speed combination is out at the Z position, but you can also have Jahan Dotson out there. There's not really one way to do any of these things because you have Jahan Dotson, who is great in space. He can get open versus zones. There's more room to run routes out there, and you will see man coverage out in the field. And if you have the opportunity to run away from those guys, you need the speed to do that. The slot receiver, usually a smaller player you're protecting with the fact that he's aligned off the line of scrimmage, and he's got a two-way go, meaning he can go left and right out of his break because he's in the middle of the football field. That is a separator, a guy who might have more agility and elusiveness than straight line speed, but you also can have a KJ Hamler that plays in the slot as a vertical threat. Another guy who played in the slot, Deshaun Hamilton, who was kind of a vertical slot threat, but had that route running ability, maybe wasn't a dominant size or speed player, but had a great combination of skills to get open in the slot. So that's the basic breakdown of what you're looking for from those three positions. And then guys typically have an overlapping set of skills that can play more than one position. And Andy Kotelnicki is all about diversity of your ability. So you're not lining up just at X. You're not lining up just in the slot. You'll end up in the slot by motions, all those things. So in this offense, it is fluid, but everyone has a starting position. Everyone has, when you fill out the depth chart, it can't just be a bunch of spaghetti. Somebody has to start somewhere and then move from there. And that's how I would generally break down what you're trying to do and how then you can go accomplish that.
Well, lots to discuss moving forward as the Penn State offseason rolls forward throughout the month of January and beyond. And we'll, of course, be doing that here on BWI Live Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And whenever breaking news happens, like the Penn State defensive coordinator search, it will eventually come to an end. And when it does, we'll break it down here on the Blue White Illustrated YouTube channel. T. Frank, final thoughts before we get out of here?
Nope, that's it. That's all I got. You got all I have today.
All right. Well, that's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickle. Join us for the latest on the Penn State defensive coordinator search and everything else going on this offseason over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. It's $1 for 7 days of access. We appreciate you listening and watching. We will talk to you next time on BWI Live.